Art is a language. It's a visual language. Art is communication. Art is entertainment. Art is educational and informative. Art is therapy, and art is therapeutic. Art does not need to be difficult to learn, and art is not only for those quote unquote born with talent. And for those in doubt, there is no subject that's been exhausted by already having been. Any idea, any concept, any message has the potential to be explained a million different ways. My goal and hope is that this show will help all of you to understand these points and offer solutions for learning, building that ideal portfolio, advancing your skills, or level up to that next great plateau of understanding and performance. And I would also like to share with you many amazing artists who speak clearly and boldly in the work they do and push the boundaries of our craft. This show is catered to all forms of 2D and 3D art, and I hope all of you will find something beneficial in each episode that could help you on your way on your personal artistic journey. Thank you all for stopping by. Now let's get into the studio and level up.
Hello there, I'm Ron Lemon, and this is Level Up with Lemonade, installment 6 of the Figure Drawing Masterclass, part 1 of rendering. Yes, rendering, we've finally gotten there, at last. If you haven't watched the previous video on Notan, I highly recommend that you do, so that you understand the setup for this particular video. I'm going to be using the same two figures that I was working with in that particular video and just continue them out to completion. I won't have time to finish them entirely since it does take many hours to render, but I'm going to get certain sections of them mostly completed so you can see what it means to work out the turning of the form. We're going to be working only in grayscale this time. Color comes in part 2. So we reduce the number of complex gradations that we're looking for. But keep in mind, this isn't easy to do, especially if you don't have the dexterity yet to work with the tools that you use. But it's not that difficult either. And understanding that rendering is gradation, that's exactly what we're doing all over the form, is just adding a bunch of complex gradations. It dispels what rendering is and makes it a lot easier to approach. Then it's just a matter of practice. Practicing rendering, but also practicing dexterity and the ability to work over a form with a different amount of pressure to the stylus, pencil, pastel, whatever it is that you choose to use, or leaning into different values of those. If especially you're working with pastels, going from darker values to lighter values in transition to create those forms. I'll have a few shorter sections before the demonstrations that explain where all those gradations fall over the form, and labeling them or numbering them so that you understand that, yes, okay, I've taken care of gradation number 1, then gradation number 2, and so forth. The more that you can kind of build a technical understanding of what rendering is, the easier it is for you to sit down, look at your subject matter, and figure out how long it's going to take you, but not get freaked out by the process, since this is all we're doing now. This is the only thing left to do, is just gradate, gradate, gradate over and over and over again on all the different areas of the form. As we add color, of course, it's going to be a bit more complex because we're looking for different types of gradations. But in grayscale, we don't have that same complex thinking that we have to do right now. We're still looking for several different types of gradations, but not nearly as many with different attributes in mind, like temperature versus value versus local color and so forth. It's just light to dark. That's all it is. So again, as I said before, if you haven't watched part 5, I highly recommend that you go back and watch it. You'll find a link right here, and you can click back over to that and watch what I'm doing to break down the posterization using notan as the form of measure to make sure that everything is correct in its lightness and darkness before we execute the gradations. All right, with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with those first few sections.
Welcome to the last video in this masterclass, and this one is on the term rendering. Rendering should have another term labeled for it: gradation. When you're rendering something, you're creating the gradient between the shadow side and the light side, around the light side, away from our view, across the surface planes because the light is more to the left or to the right. The rest of the surface that's lit is going to fade in a gradation as the light falls away from the central portion of it. In this case, with the spotlight, the central portion is somewhere right around in here. And in every direction from that center point, we get a fall off of that brightness. It becomes a gradation. You can see the gradation out here very easily. And as it moves further into the center, it's a little bit more difficult to see. But as you train, and you train your eyes to see these things, they become much easier to find. So there's an important understanding of how many gradations do we actually have to do. We have a cylinder here, and this cylinder has all the appropriate edges that we're going to find that we have to turn the form in order to make this look like a cylinder. We have the terminator, which is right along in here. This is the terminator. Now, if the terminator has something bright to the shadow side surrounding the object, it's going to throw light back into the shadow, which is called reflected light. We can see a bit of reflected light down here. We don't see it as easily up here because the object is further from the surface. However, now that I've circled both of those, can your eyes see the transition that's going all the way up through here as it gets closer and closer to the point where there is little to no reflected light? Hopefully you will see that. The more you study, the easier it will be for you to see that. From the terminator into the light, we have gradation number 1. From the terminator into the shadow, we have gradation number 2. From the edge of the lit form in towards the light source, we have edge number 3 or gradation number 3. And in the shadow side, from the contour into the form towards the terminator, we have gradation number 4. We have gradation number 5 going from the bottom of the object to the top of the object. We have gradation number 6 going from the top of the object to the bottom of the object. And that is because the light source is coming from up here, so it will be brighter towards the top and darker towards the bottom. So there are 6 gradations within that particular area. We have a 7th gradation across the top of here because we have another surface. So this is gradation number 7. In the shadow, we have a gradation from the back end of it towards the object itself. So that's gradation number 8. And then we have a smaller gradation right down over here, and that's gradation number 9. That's your ambient occlusion. If this was an outdoor object, we would have several others. From the ambient light, which is the secondary light source that illuminates the object. And then in our background, we have the gradations that fall off along in here, but they go all the way out to the center point. We also have a gradation right here of a reflection going from sharper to non-existent. So it's clearer towards the edge of the object, and it's less clear the further away it goes. So that's another gradation. So in total now, we have 9 on the object, then we have 10 in its surrounding space. We have 11 with the reflected object. That's how many gradations we have to create in order to recreate this particular object. If you've been in a form drawing class before and you had your teacher point out, even though you thought you did a really good job with it, they could still point out that there were parts that were missing. This is the reason why. There's a good number of gradations taking place within an image. And unless you address all of those gradations, the object will not be rendered clearly. The object will be lacking in certain parts of the picture that will cause it to not look complete. Remember, this is realism that we're studying. We're studying how to recreate something so that it appears just like it does in front of us if we're drawing from life, or in the photo reference. So it is up to you to be a good detective and determine how many different directions the light is coming from, what the type of object is that the light is illuminating, what that object is sitting on top of, and what's near it. All of those elements together will equal the answer to how to address this particular image to render it properly. But everything is a gradation. So rendering equals gradation. Rendering is nothing more than gradient. If you're doing something impressionistic, you're putting color tiles on top of color tiles to create the transition, or grayscale tiles on top of grayscale tiles to create the gradation, the transition. If you're doing this in a very hyper-real or extremely realistic fashion, then it's much, much smaller tiles that sit next to each other. Tiles meaning a swatch of tone. And they sit right next to one another, and all of them together create the illusion of a turning surface. In reality, we don't recognize the faceting. Each surface, each tile is a facet. We don't recognize those on turned forms like the human form. We don't notice that there's planes that are constantly changing. Each of those planes could be considered a facet. However, the more impressionistic realism you create in your work, the smaller the tiles will be. But there's no blending them together. It's the value and color change in each of those tiles as the form is turning. So dependent upon how many surfaces there are on the object that create that continuum will determine how many tiles you'll be placing on top of it. If something is heavily faceted, which we'll look at in a little bit, you don't have as many tiles that need to be reproduced in order to turn the form, especially when those tiles are delineated by an edge. You have a fall off of light turning in each of those areas. But when those tiles are small, like we can see here with the cylinder, it creates a continuous turn, and it's very hard to imagine that there's these little facets that need to be implemented in order to create the turn of the form. Some painters think if you put two colors next to each other, you can just soften them into one another, and you're creating the turn of that form. In some instances, that can work, but what will also happen is that you'll weaken the color as you blend them into one another, which is why, again, you use facets of color to turn the form rather than trying to soften everything by blending it out. The more of those colors you use within a certain space, the more you can soften them into one another, but you don't want to lose their value or their chroma, or you'll weaken the structure, and that will thereby break the illusion. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. So again, for the object, we have 9 major facets, including the shadow pattern, that we have to address when we're painting this form. Here we have a more complex situation with multiple objects that sit near one another that all have the same intensity of local value. They're all white, sitting on a darker surface. So the surface is absorbing some of the light, while the objects themselves are reflecting the light back and forth from each other because of their proximity to one another, which means then that there's a more complex moment in this particular situation that we have to address. The light from this cube is bouncing into the sphere. The light from the floor plane is bouncing into the sphere. Then we have the ambient occlusion here, which is the part of the underside that is not receiving any reflected light or very little reflected light. The shadow is getting further from the ball along here, which means there's going to be an absence of reflected light at a certain point along its surface, where the shadow over here is much closer to the ball, so that continuous reflected light is going to go under the ball further. You have the hot spot on the ball here, which is where the light source is hitting it. And we know it's right here and not back farther because our shadows are going in this particular direction, which means that the center line of the object going in that direction would be somewhere right around in here, and the light source is going to be hitting the ball roughly in that location. So we have a fall off of light through here. We have our terminator. So we have our gradation coming from here. We have a gradation coming from here. All the way around the ball, we have gradations gradating inward. Then we have the ball casting a shadow down here, and we can see within that shadow it's going from lighter to darker this way. We have a cast shadow over here. It's going from lighter to darker this way. And it's going lighter to darker this way because it's sitting on a turned surface. We have all the edges we saw earlier in the cylinder. We have a gradation going this way. We have a gradation going this way, going this way. Our hot spot or our brightest spot is right along in here. We have a gradation going in this direction and this direction, and we have one coming in this way. Then we have a gradation that's even stronger because of the cone bouncing light into this, and it's going upward this way. We have the cast shadow on the ground, and then we have the cylinder affecting the cone. So the brightness of the cone feels like it's further over this way because not only do we have the direct light source hitting it, but we also have reflected light coming from the object sitting next to it. So there's a brightness within this area, but it's further over to the left than on this object or on this object. Oh, and then we also have the gradation going down from the light through here. We have a gradient going along here, and it's getting weaker as it goes up towards the top. We have a gradation this way, a gradation this way, a gradation this way, a gradation this way. And then we have a gradation going this way. We have a gradation going outward this way. We have the reflected light down here. Then we have the cube, and the cube has a gradation going this way, a gradation going this way, a gradation going this way, a gradation going this way. That's the reflected light coming from the cone. Then we have an ambient occlusion along here, which is a smaller gradation. We have a gradation going out this way, but we also have one going this way with the reflected light coming from the cone. And then we have an ambient occlusion right here. We also have a gradation going this way within the shadow along the cone here. Every object, regardless of whether it has flat surfaces or turned surfaces, are complex. This is our pattern that we have to develop or evolve as we're copying our reference. We also have the gradients through these areas, the long gradient going from one side to the other, the smaller gradients going inward from all these different directions. And then in the background there is a little bit of a gradient as it's heading up the wall. There's a wall in the back of this. In fact, the way that this scene is set up, we have our objects here, and then there's a wall that goes up this way with a turn in the backdrop. So there's a transitional gradient along here, and then there's light that's going to begin transitioning along here and along over in here. Now you wouldn't know that first looking at it, and you wouldn't know that because you didn't set the scene up. I set the scene up so I'm aware of all those little nuances that are taking place. But the more developed your eye is, the more practice you do with these concepts, the easier these things will be for you to see. Like this edge right here of the reflected light from the cube, which there's one over here as well. And there's also reflected light along here and along here for the cone. And if those lights aren't addressed on the floor plane in all of those objects, but only addressed right here, it's going to look a little bit strange and incomplete to the viewer because we're only addressing one edge as opposed to multiple edges. Now I bring this image in because this has a second light source to it, and this is how most of us have to work in a classroom setting or at home. We have a spotlight on the object, but then we also have the room light within the space, and that weakens the relationship between the direct light source and the shadow side. But you can still see the shadows in here. It's just that they also have indirect light inside of them as well. That reduces the range of contrast. We can see right here the original range of contrast. That's how dark it is from the previous image we looked at. But because there's a large light sitting over the top of all four of these forms, it's producing an atmosphere for this particular space right here. But the rest of the room is really dark. So any place that we get an ambient occlusion that's really strong, like the one that's under the sphere, we're going to see the value change back into the original contrast point of the shadows from the spotlight. The spotlight is strong, but the ambient light overhead is so much larger that it's opening up the range of value across all the forms that are facing upward towards that light. And of course, the underside of the sphere is not. So it is not going to be catching that light the same way all the other objects are. In this instance, what I've done is I've shifted the temperature of the light source, the primary light source, from the indirect light. This is how most lighting scenarios work. Warm light, cool shadows. Cool shadows are usually coming from ambient light. Outdoors, it's the blue sky. Indoors, it could be fluorescent overhead lighting, especially if you're in a school setting. So it starts getting really confusing looking. However, as you develop an eye for seeing the change in value, you'll also start to develop a sense of change in temperature when you start addressing color. Now I've pushed this image a little bit stronger here, and you can see the color as it falls off. And the sphere is the most affected, but the top of the cylinder is also affected. You can see warm light along this edge, but as it goes back further, it cools off and becomes part of the blue family from the overhead lighting. The sphere over here is doing the same thing. Somewhere right around in here, the two light sources are mixing together, but up over here, it's all skylight. Now the primary light source, we could call the sun, is hitting the other side of that because we know that from the previous images. However, the strength of that light source is being weakened by the overhead lighting. The top of the cube is a little bit cooler here, but a little bit warmer over here. There will be these weird dynamic shifts in temperature occurring, and I believe a lot of that is physiological more than it is actual or factual to the surface. Along the cube over here, we can see a transition across here in the strength of the light source as it's going from the upper corner to the lower corner. And then down below along here, we get a pretty intense color because of the bounce light coming up from the floor plane. On the cone, it gets weaker around this way, so we get more blue light affecting this particular strip along here. The cylinder is the same way. We get this edge along in here being affected by the blue light, the ambient light in the room. And the rest of this along through here is the temperature of the primary light source. But it too starts to weaken along this edge as it turns away from our eye, and it starts to take on the bounce light from all of these areas over here. This is why painting is put off until we understand form, which is through drawing. Drawing helps you see the forms more easily through values, and it helps you identify the change in a surface as it's turning. When we introduce color into it, not only do we need to be aware of the change of value, but we also need to be aware of the change in color as it's transitioning. And that color is two parts. Local color, the color of the object, and the color of the light source affecting that object, as we can see here with these white objects. This is why in an art school, you start with casts. When you're drawing from a cast, all the local color is removed. If you were to start with a human form, you would be dealing with the flesh color plus the color changes in the light sources. And that makes things, it compounds the problem that you're trying to solve. But when the objects are stark like this, it makes things much easier for you to develop muscle memory and memory based upon experience that's going to carry over into everything else that you do.
If you really like what you're hearing and seeing on these videos, please consider subscribing to this channel. In addition, subscribe to my Discord channel and you can post questions over there all day long regarding art, the art field, and whatever else you'd like to post, and I'm more than happy to answer those questions. If you really like this content, please consider becoming a member of this channel or supporting me over on my Patreon page, where in both instances, I post up additional exercises and lessons for you to work with regarding the information in these videos and a whole lot more. All right, let's get back into the content. Thank you again.
Here's the same scene now with color on all the surfaces. And this again is where things get pretty complicated, which is why drawing from a cast is a lot easier than drawing from colored objects. We can see how complex the whole situation is. We can feel the temperature of the primary light source right around in here, and then we can see the immediate fall off of color and temperature and value from that particular spot. Then we have the terminator, and we have a gradation going this way. But in addition, we have a gradation going around this way, which I forgot to mention in the previous drawings. We have that happening in either instance. And it's the same within the shadow side. There's a change in value as it's moving around the object from one side to the other. But we also have the transitions coming in this way. This is being affected by the floor plane. This is being affected by the cube. This is being affected by the cylinder. So we also have a transition along here of reflected light. So the sphere is a very complex form because of its continuous change of direction in all directions, where the cylinder and the cone are a little less complex and the cube further. The cube is the least difficult, the least complicated because of its flatter surfaces. However, even within each of these surfaces, there's a change in temperature as the light is moving across the form. There's a slight change in value, but there's a major change in temperature. The bottom portion of the cube along here is going to be stronger in the floor color than over along in here. Now, why is it an arc like this and going this way getting weaker? Because the primary light source is the strongest through this area along in here, and it gets weaker as it falls off. And since the cube is closer to the edge of the light, it isn't going to be affected as much over here by the direct light source as it will be over here. On this side of the cube, we can see purple all up along in here, but we can also see blue around through here. Then down along in here, the ambient occlusion becomes stronger with all of these colors being thrown back and forth across the surface. We can see the absence of color much more easily. We have the blue light passing through this way and this way within the shadow. We have the cube creating a shadow within the shadow along in here. And then we have the change in value as it's moving out this way. The same thing is happening with this shadow and this shadow. Out over here and over here is lighter than as it gets closer and closer to the objects that are casting the shadows. The cone is the least affected by all the other objects because it's facing this way as opposed to facing this way. Or even the cylinder is being affected down along in here by the red cube. It's being less affected as it goes up this way. The cone is affecting it through here. The purple is affecting it through here. And then as we get up around in this area, none of the surfaces are affecting it anymore. It's the atmosphere from the room space.
Along here, we can see the fall off, and it's falling off a little bit differently in all three of those directions. It's a little bit darker over on this edge, so we have the transition coming in this way, the transition going this way, the transition going this way, the transition going this way, and the hot spot somewhere right around over in here. The hot spot on the cone is here, up along the top, and down along in here towards the bottom. Then we have the ground plane and its changes in value as they're shifting towards the light source. So this is without the overhead light. Now if I turn on the overhead light, one more layer of complexity occurs. Yes, this is the same purple backdrop, but notice how the blue light overhead weakens the local color. It shifts the local color into the blue direction, but we have this warm spotlight overhead, and it's keeping the local color a little bit more visible within this space right along in here. And that weakens as it transitions out along these areas around through here. It's much stronger right under along in here because of the overhang of the ball, blocking the overhead light, the skylight, while the warm light is directional this way. So we are seeing the effects of that directional light along through here, and it's keeping the purple looking purple within that little band. But then everything else along here is, because the overhead light is directly overhead, the edges of the ball right around through here are preventing that light from affecting what's directly underneath it within these areas along in here. You can see the shadow of the cube through here. You can see part of the local color along in here because of the ambient occlusion. And then the rest of this is the blue light. As it gradates inward and gets darker, we can also see a cutoff along here, which is a result of the bright light here and the bright light here bouncing light this way, and the edge of the cube blocking that light from going around the corner, so to speak. You can see the effects of much weaker back here, much stronger in here, weaker out here, stronger in here, weaker out here, stronger in here, and so forth within the shadow spaces between the two light sources as they're hitting the ground plane and the surface. You can see the cone affecting the cylinder here, but you don't see it affecting it up here. And in fact, it looks green up there. And the reason is because blue plus orange equals green, just like blue plus yellow equals green. Because there's yellow in orange, it's going to shift in a green direction as the shadow is turning in space and being affected by that blue light source. You can see the change in temperature up here. It's getting a little more greenish in the back and slightly warmer towards the front. And then you can also see that change in color through here and this way. So the green ball is affecting the shadow over here, of course. The green ball is also affecting portions of it along in here. And as it goes up higher, the green ball no longer bounces light directly into it. It's starting to shoot the light up around this way. But there is a portion of the ball that is shooting the light this way. You can see the local color of the cylinder as we get closer to the terminator. Now outdoors, when you're looking at cars in a parking lot, if you've heard this before, you can see the reason why here, that you can tell the local color of a metal object closer to the edge of the shadow than anywhere else, because the rest of the car is being affected by the overhead lighting, whether it's the sky or the sun. It's blowing out the local color and causing distortions within that local color. But the closer you get to the terminator, the shadow edge, the easier that local color will be to identify. The cone is the hardest one to understand because it just looks soft and pale. But this side of the cone is warm and this side of the cone is cool. So if you were to paint this side, it would be blue plus a little bit of the orangey light. And more so within this area right up along in here, where down here, it's going to start shifting towards a warm purple because of the red from the cube bouncing into it. And then on this side, it's going to be cool blue, stronger up here, weaker down here, as the lower portion is going to be affected by the purple on the ground plane.
and the purple that's closest to the cone, because the further out we go, of course, the purple gets cooler in temperature. So we have a shifting of temperature and value in every particular direction. The back of the sphere over here is going to be more influenced by the blue light, but more influenced by the direct light over here. And the same thing with these surfaces of the cube. Warmer over here, getting cooler as it goes back this way. Warmer up here, getting cooler as it goes down this way because of the purple that's affecting the surface. And then in here you can see that it gets a bit more ruddy here, but it gets bluer and more purple as it goes up in this particular direction. So this is the complexity of a surface. When we're identifying something that we're looking at, the better informed you are in understanding all of these traits, the easier it will be for you to render forms. Just like in the backdrop here, here's that curvature. This is the blue light hitting it along here. This is the spotlight affecting it down here. And the spotlight is affecting it up here only because the purple is bouncing light up into that particular area. But the further over this way it goes and the further over this way it goes, it's more of the blue light overhead, but not directly hitting it because this is a vertical surface and it's not catching as much light as this changing surface and across here that's facing directly opposite the light source. And then, of course, we have all the reflected lights down along in here to deal with and being able to identify the change in temperature within them and the fall off as they're less influential on the floor plane. The lower and lower they go because there isn't as much intensity of the surface on the object, and the height of the object together are going to influence where that falls off or where that cuts off. Okay, so now that we've seen this and we understand it all the way through to color, in today's renders, I won't be dealing with color, but in this case, we're going to focus on the grayscale, and I'm going to start rendering into one of the figures that you saw in the no-tan video prior to this one. Let's go ahead and move over to that demonstration so we can begin understanding how to turn the form. Before we get started on that render, I want to make sure that I get to this concept as well. I almost forgot, which is the faceting. Same cylinder from the beginning to the end here, roughly the same size. It's a little bit wider on the new cylinders that I've added here, but for the most part, they're close to the same size. This cylinder has 8 surfaces to it. This has 18. This has 32. This has 512. And that's the number of changes of the surfaces as they go around the object from one side to the other. In these particular cylinders, you can see the effect of the change in surface through the change in the value. Now, both this, actually all 3 of these in their shadows aren't as strong as the shadow of this one because they have a cylinder sitting right next to them, bouncing light back into them. And so you get these little areas like right along here, or over here you get these 2 facets blurring into one another because both of those surfaces next to one another are receiving a similar amount of light from the reflected lights of the cylinder sitting next to that surface. So this cylinder is bouncing light into here, and both of these are being affected by it. This surface being more affected than this surface. This surface is mostly being illuminated by the atmosphere in the room space, but these are being illuminated by the reflected light at a similar value range. So that's why you get a blur through this central space right along in here. The reflected light is going back in this way at an angle downward from up here down this way. It's not directly bouncing it back over. It's bouncing it back down at an angle. And then down here, you're getting the effect of the floor that's influencing this part. And then the further up it goes, the more it's being influenced by the surface over here. This is doing the same thing. In fact, over here, we can see the strength of it on that one particular facet. While over here, it gets a little more complicated and you don't see it as easily, but there's a fall off taking place over here and over here. And then this back facet right back over in here is not being affected as strongly as these facets are from the reflected light on the cylinder. And that's why it's darkening as it inches closer to the edge of the form. As a painter, you would start with this kind of block in. Then you would add more facets of change in value, and then more, until you get to something like this. With this many facets, you could start to soften the edges through here, and you will get a continuum of this sort, but you have to be really careful because, again, when you push these colors into one another, they start to negate each other as opposed to complement each other. If you want a stronger turn in form, you keep adding more and more surface facets until you achieve something of this kind of clean, clear, and transitional gradient across the surfaces. So this is what it means to facet. And then, of course, when we bring in those light sources with their temperatures, you can see how down below along in here, the ground plane is affecting this one. And that's the same thing that's taking place with each of these. The lower portion of each of these facets is being influenced by the floor plane. And that would be all across here, 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 and here as well. And as it moves up higher, it's more the direct light source that's affecting these particular areas. And as we get higher still up into the object, it's the overhead light that's affecting these surfaces. With these sitting next to one another, you can see the influence of local color, local value entering into the shadow spaces and influencing each of these areas. And they become much more chromatic because of this color over here. Not because of their own local surface, but because of the colored surface of the object sitting next to them. That's where that chroma is coming from. It's not because of the absence of light, it's because of the reflected light that you're seeing this. And then across the surfaces, especially on these two, you can see the warm light going to cool light. Over here, this is far enough over from the center of the light source that it isn't being affected in the same way. And this one's far enough over this way and is actually in the transition area where you're going to see some influence of the direct light source, but mostly the influence of the skylight affecting it. And as each of these change in direction, you can see the influence of the direct and indirect light source. Here, the direct light source. Here's a mixture of the direct and indirect light. And then along in here, it's even more complex. Direct light source influence, 80% direct, 20% indirect, 70-30, 50-50, and then all indirect light source. But we start the same kind of percentage scale based upon reflected light as opposed to direct light. On a more refined surface, it's much harder to see that kind of faceting taking place. But once again, the further along you develop your eye and the longer you stay in school to learn these things or stick with a mentor who paints to help you see these things, the more developed your eye is going to be, and the easier it will be for you to paint something convincingly because you understand the complexity of these transitions. Now, let's get to the first render. So I'm not sure how much of this I'm going to render because rendering takes quite a bit of time. A drawing, depending upon how realistic we go, can take hours to render the form because of how many gradients we're looking for. But I'm going to work on some of the larger areas. I think this leg and this leg I'll definitely render because they're larger areas of mass. And they have what are called islands within them. Islands are another subset of gradations that we need to work on that are not bound to the shadow patterns. These are isolated from the shadow pattern, which is why they're called islands. And they have
many complex gradations within each of them, especially the kneecap and the tendons surrounding the knee. Because of its extrusion from the leg cylinders, we're going to be dealing with another series of forms. And then there's the island of the quadriceps separating from the iliotibial tract, and the muscles on the back of the leg right along through here as another island of sorts. But note that all of these islands of shadow and halftone are still somehow connected to the shadow patterns, so they don't become so isolated that they stand out or stand alone. So one of the things that I need to do is figure out variability of pressure. Now I'm going back and forth with my strokes here, and that's not necessarily a good thing, because you'll see that at the ends of the strokes, they get darker because of the transition back and forth and the overlap of the lines, but also the abrupt change in pressure that I'm applying as I'm moving the hand back and forth, which is why when you shade, it's a good idea to transition in one direction or pull strokes in one direction rather than transitioning, but also be careful about the amount of pressure that you have. So your brush strokes should go from light to dark to light, light to dark to light, as it pulls across the surface. That way, the lighter end over here can be intersected by another set of brush strokes, and you don't have as much disruption taking place along those edges. But in addition, we want to figure out how to go from a darker value to a lighter value as we gradate. Now you can see all this noise within the brush stroke because I'm using a brush that has texture to it and has a shape to it as well that is sharp. Let me see if you can kind of see the shape has sharp edges all the way around it. And those are elements that I have to contend with. But I'll do this up close here. I also want to make sure that you can see where my cursor is. So as I'm doing these, you can follow the cursor's movement. But as I start to put these brush strokes down and I get these ribbons of emptiness or a lighter value in between the darker values, I want to scale the brush down just enough to where I can fit in between those little spaces and fill those in to make a more uniform transition. Now this takes some practice. All of this is going to take practice, learning how to gradate. All right, so the first area that we're going to work with, and I want to make sure that my reference is on screen at the same time, is the leg along the edge between the terminator and the light side. Now another thing to note here, muscles change scale and then turn into tendons. And we have to be aware of the transitions that occur on both sides of that muscle. The gradations that we pull through here are going to be longer and slower, while the gradations down near the end will be more abrupt. And then when we get to the tendon, even sharper. So an edge does not stay constant. The only time it would stay constant, and we've saw on the cylinders that they also don't stay constant depending upon the surroundings because of all the different bounce light influences. But on something like this, you'll have a much more constant edge from top to bottom. But on something like this, you're going to get a change in scale along that edge. It's going to pinch as it gets closer to the sharper or more acute portions. And then through here, of course, it's going to be very tight. But notice how this goes from narrow to wider through here and then gets narrow again through here. And that's because of the curviness of the shape and how that curve changes when it goes from broader areas to more acute areas. But the first gradient that I pull through here is going to be somewhat consistent to start off with, because all I'm trying to do is soften the edge. Just want to get it a little bit blurry so we can move forward from there. And then around the kneecap, it's going to be a smaller gradation. Now there's even smaller gradations that fall off of these because of the bone versus the tendon and the fascia and so forth. But to start off with, I try to build a consistency to it. And there's a reason for this. As I build a consistency along here and compare it to my reference, I can start to see the subtleties in the reference more easily because I'm comparing something that's very mechanical looking to something that's organic. So my eyes are going to start to note, oh yeah, it does get a lot softer through here, and then it starts to sharpen again. There's a transitional change right along in here. There's a transitional change here and down along in here. It's not constant in those areas. So that then tells me over here, I can go a little bit softer through this area in here. It starts to get sharper up along in here. I can go softer down along here. Through here sharpens a little bit more. And again, up here, it starts to sharpen a little more. So what do? I grab this local value over here to pull the edge back in. And when I want to extend it, I go back to the shadow value and extend it out farther. Now, any of the values that occur out in here, I'm going to go ahead and grab a value from the transitional space in here, which is not going to be nearly as dark as the shadow, but it's still going to be darker. And once I start to use it, I can quickly see, okay, well, some of that's a little too dark. So I'll go slightly lighter with the value that I'm working with. Then I'll pull that local value again and go over it to lighten it up even further. And of course, this is the luxury of digital. With a pencil or traditional material, I would be doing this very differently. I would be changing the pencil type from a B pencil to an H pencil. H is not going to go as dark as a B, so it's going to be much easier for me to control the value range out here using a softer or using a harder pencil out here, a softer pencil in here for the change in value. Now, the other thing we have to be aware of is the faceting from the musculature. So back along in here is the gluteus maximus, and it's all along here until it gets to the great trochanter. It's sort of the same value, but not. And in fact, in this particular instance, because of the spotlight hitting her, it's actually a change in temperature more than it is a change in value. So I need to be very careful not to overdo the values back here, but I still need that transition and change. And then there's the turned edge out here, which I can either grab the background value or the shadow value of her and use that to soften the edge just a little bit further to turn it in space so it doesn't look like it's abruptly cutting off, the same way everything down along here looks for the moment. The perimeter edge is the most difficult edge to work with because it's the fastest changing transition, but it needs to be implied if the figure is not going to look cut out from the background. So there will be a softening here, especially on this portion through here, because this is all facing downward. Then as it starts to turn upward or outward, it isn't going to be as soft along through here. However, I'm going to start it soft so I can determine where to strengthen it, to change its influence of turning away from our eye or facing more towards our eye. And it's going to be through this midsection here that I'm going to make it a little bit sharper so that that muscle doesn't turn away from us as quickly. So I've now addressed the two sides of the lit portion of her. As we go up here, this gradation is longer through the tensor fascia lata. It's also longer through the top of the rectus femoris. As that runs into the vastus lateralis, it's going to continue transitioning around her leg, but a much lighter value range. And then as we go down this way, everything gets narrower, so everything gets darker. So there's going to be the vertical gradation now that I apply through here. A little bit darker towards the knee, and then it gets lighter as it goes upward. And I'm terminating against that island that separates the quadricep from the bicep femoris. And because the light is going from light to dark this way, the darkness that we see out over here is the lifting of the next muscle. So I don't want this muscle in particular to be the darker of the two back along in here. I'm going to use the local value again and shift that over. Then I'll use the shadow value and make an impression along here using very light pressure applied. And this terminates against the greater trochanter on our leg bone. And as we turn this gradation here, it starts to isolate the great trochanter, which is this big highlight on her hip. All of this is on the underside, or the turned downward planes, which is going to bring more light to the great trochanter, which is facing towards the light source. And then I'm going to gradate this a little bit longer through here, so this isn't a line. I don't want it to look like an outline. I want it to look like a surface form. This cursor highlighter is really throwing me off a little bit. So if you see me fumbling for a moment here and there, it's because I'm trying to get used to working through this big green dot that I see on my screen. It's also slowing down the brush as it's passing over the surface. It's causing it to jitter a little bit, which is also new for me. We'll get through it. Up here is lighter, so if I need to affect an entire area, I make the brush as large as possible to affect the largest space possible. I'm going to gradate underneath here, softening it even further. Now my terminator is a little bit wonky because it goes from this extremely flat area to a textural area, which means that I should probably work on this side for a little bit before I start making rash decisions on how to fix this. Now, the first thing I want to do is create the ambient occlusion, and that's along through here where the two legs are coming together. It's going to be its darkest through this midsection here, and then that gradates and gets lighter as it comes forward this way. I'll soften that up, let it gradate a little bit farther, and then I'm going to stop for a moment, and I'm going to go even darker now along here, pushing that ambient occlusion further. And it's not an outline, remember, and it's passing over different muscle heads as it's moving away from the other leg. And then I'm going to use this same value along the edge of the shadow pattern up here, especially on the tensor fascia. That's where it appears the darkest in the photograph. And then I'm going to use a little bit of it down through here, but I'm going to be very careful how dark to go and how wide I'm going to make it, as the rest of her leg is reflected light through this section. And that means bringing in a slightly lighter value along this edge over here, less so up here because there isn't as much light bouncing back and forth. It's the strongest down around the knee through here. And then I'm going to go back to my core shadow value and continue that transition around the leg down a little bit lower where the rectus femoris tendon meets the vastus medialis. And then I'm going to do the same thing right up along in here at the tensor fascia lata, extending the gradation over towards her shorts or her bikini bottom. So this isn't a strong outline, it's just a slightly stronger value in the shadow. And then there's the gradient fall off. It's a little bit darker up along through here, so I'm going to pull some brush strokes across the form this way and lighten them up as I get closer and closer to the strongest part of the reflected light. Now that there's texture all over the shadow, I can begin thinking about how to carry this value out away from the tensor fascia with a little bit more care, because I can now see a more uniform consistency across all of the surfaces. And that darker value extends out this way into the gluteus medius, further framing the greater trochanter, the highlight or the hot spot in the middle of the leg there. And then there's more gradation along here as we drop into the vastus lateralis. It's a little bit messy through here. But when I get those stripes that are too dark, I grab the local value from in that area and I use a wide brush
to clean up the noise that's in those little spots. Then draw this out again through here. There's a spot forming right here, so I'll grab the local value to clean that up. Grab the shadow value to darken it down just a little bit more once it is cleaned up. And continue doing both of those actions until I see a smoother transition occurring. But you can see that it's work. It doesn't just happen all at once. It takes a little bit of time to get some of these to work properly. And when you have a nice green cursor sitting right over the top of your brush strokes, that doesn't help at all. It's just one more added element of complexity that makes this all the more difficult to do. But I'm not complaining. I'm just letting you know. I have worked with worse. Gradations around the knee. Going to go a little bit darker over here on this side to build out one of those islands. Then the local value back through it to soften the gradation. The kneecap is far too bright. I'm going to go ahead and darken all of it down. It's turned away from the light source far enough that it's not receiving the same kind of intense light as the thigh over here is. I'm going to shrink the brush even further so that I can make smaller shapes next to the kneecap, smaller shapes down along the tibial tendon to help sharpen the edges by using that smaller brush. And then I'm going to pick from the core shadow to build a small core shadow across the patella through here and down along the patellar tendon through here. Then down into the lower leg, I'm going to grab the shadow value and pull a gradient across this edge, softer through this part in the middle here, getting sharper as it comes up and inserts into the leg up here and it down here where it starts to turn tendinous through the tibialis anterior. Then those same values are going to be used across the tendons through here and across the top of the foot along here next to the big toe. And then lighter through here, a little darker under the ankle, a little darker towards the gastrocnemius and soleus tendons, a little darker across the side plane of the foot, then darker through this section. This is all turned away from the light source. Darker along the back of the leg here to help turn those forms more. Darker down along here where the tendons overlap and attach to the fibula. Grab the local value of this area to soften these and lighten them up a little bit. Softening just basically means I'm gradating them from the lighter values to the darker values closer to towards the edges of the form. Softer down along through here as it becomes more of a turn of the form between two different muscles. Both of those muscles together are creating a much larger transition. I'm going to pull some of that over to the right to darken this down just a little further. Now you can start to see, especially in this midsection, how it's really nicely turning. To the fibula over here, behind the fibula back along through here. And then the gradient through here is a little too bright. I'm going to pull a transition value over the top of it. That way the ankle bone has a top plane facing towards the light source that's brighter than all the rest of its surroundings, which should be darker in value. Gradation along here should be softer. Grabbing the shadow value to help pull that out just a little bit farther in its gradation. Remember, I'm not making it as dark as the shadow, but I'm using the darker value to create a stronger change than if I was to use the local values out here and just subtly lighten everything. And then the other thing that I'm contending with is that my brush has transition to it, meaning that it can change direction depending upon how I connect with the surface. So while sometimes it's like this, sometimes it's a sharp line like that. And I have to be really careful because that sharp line will immediately disrupt everything that I've been working on with the much broader side of the brush. And there is a lot of coming back and fixing things based upon the brush change in its scale. Those brush strokes I usually just hit undo, as it's not really worth it to spend the extra few minutes trying to soften those brush strokes in with everything else. You just have to go across the same area and hope that I get the right edge of the brush to perform the edge that I need. A little bit softer through here. Right up along in here, the terminator's too abrupt. I'm going to come through here and soften it down further. Making the brush really wide now. Come through here and darken the lights. I don't want to compete with the brightness up here. It's further down from the light source, so it should not be nearly as bright as towards the top of the leg altogether. And that's the same with all the highlights back here. None of these should be as bright as the top of the leg. Now down in the foot, I want to use plainer brush strokes, doing stuff like this across the form to show its flatness. If I keep pulling brush strokes this way through all the forms, some of them are not going to look right anymore. There's a difference between a surface going this way and a surface going this way, and I want the brush strokes to reflect that. So down here I'm going to be using more cross contour brush strokes, where up here I'm going to be using lengthier brush strokes to show the verticality of the form. I hope that makes sense. That in itself can be another video that I could talk about, the direction of your brush strokes, because it is a really big deal, especially when you're trying to get things to feel more and more dimensional. You can use the same values all over the form, but eventually you have to use those values in a technically different way in order for things to feel like they're varying in distance, direction, and turn to the camera. And then everything else is just building upon subtlety, especially once we get into these smaller, more faceted areas like the top of the foot, because of all the tendons that are passing through the foot and the change in direction from those. And then, of course, once we get into the toes, we have another set of shapes that we have to deal with that we also have to think about. How are we going to paint them? Are we going to paint them like this, or are we going to paint them like this? There's a little bit of reflected light in the lower leg, but it isn't nearly as strong as all the reflected light along the inner portion of the thigh up here. It's strongest right underneath the kneecap here, so I grab the value from up here, and I'm using a little hint of that through this section to help create a much stronger and more dynamic core shadow in that particular area. But I do need to be careful not to go too dark with it, or it's going to change how the local value feels to the eye when we're looking at it. A little more transition through there. In the background, I just want to take this background value and crush that soft gradient that I've pulled all the way out too far. I'm going to pull a little of that gradation into the leg using that darker value to help turn it in form this way. And then right up along the back in here, it's feeling the stiffest, meaning it doesn't have very much change to it. And I want to hurry up and get to that as well, because when you leave something untouched, especially within a certain form that you're working with, those bare areas become visually influential on how you treat other areas. And I just want to be really careful not to let a sharp edge influence how sharp I go with everything else. So as we zoom out, we can look at that and see where the edges need a little more softening, where they need a little more sharpening, and so forth.
Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let others know about this video as well.
I went ahead and did a little bit of the change in value on this leg over here, just so I could see this leg more objectively. Because when one part of the body, like I said earlier, is not up to the same level of render as the rest of it, it makes things much more difficult to assess where to go and what to do with them, because you have the sharpness of the unfinished areas really strongly influencing your decisions on the other areas. And a tendency is to make things too sharp overall. So I'm bringing in a little bit more value into the shadow pattern on this side to create reflected light on one side of the tibia versus the other side of the tibia. And then turning the forms up along through here. I also should probably carry over the ambient occlusion this way just a little bit farther. And I could darken the edge on the inside in here one full value as well to help create a stronger connection between the two legs, but also making sure that it transitions and blurs out this way just enough to where it doesn't look outlined at all. And then the underside of the thigh back along in here is being illuminated by the floor plane down here. So there's reflected light in that spot, which means that I don't want to carry this dark all the way down to the bottom of the shape. I want to make sure that the bottom of the shape remains lighter than everything up along through here, which will be darker. As I zoom out though, you can start to see, based upon the upper half of the body to the lower half of the body, how much more development there is within those forms. So I'm going to zoom in on the foot, but I still need to keep my photo reference in view. And I'm going to kind of do the same thing through here. I'm going to start with shadows. We have a shadow against the pinky toe right along in here. We have a shadow between these two toes, then we have a shadow between these two toes. We have a small cast shadow from this toe onto the big toe, and I've also sort of lost the form of the big toe right along in here. And what I'm going to think about now is taking this value up along the foot all the way into all of the cylinders of the toes, and doing the same thing over here against the pinky toe. I'm going to take that same value along the side plane here and bring it through to the pinky toe. I'm going to take that same value across the tips of all the toes, because that's the part of the toe that is not facing towards the light source. So those areas will automatically be darker. Then I'm going to go across the middle knuckle through these three toes, but not the pinky toe. And then I'm going to do a slightly softer edge along the big toe here. I'm going to go very generic with it to begin with, just so there's an edge. Then I'm going to use the light value to lift the middle knuckle, and I'm going to use a slightly darker value through the toenail to express a change in color. Much like the other toes, they all have a little bit of color on them. They're all painted a reddish tone. So it might not be a bad idea to spot each of these areas where the toenail is. And this is really where this cursor highlighter is bugging, because these are such small areas, and what I'm doing is sitting directly underneath the cursor indicator. Well, likely I will need to go back through in some of these instances and clean them up after we're done here with this demonstration, so I can turn this cursor highlighter off and actually see more objectively what I'm doing. But I'm thinking about these in segments. You have the lift in the knuckle through here. The surface is facing towards the direct light source. The toenail surface along here. The front of the toe along here that's darker. And then the small cast shadows on the side planes of each of these toes from the previous toe. And then the transitional value as it goes up and over the cylinder forms of each of these toes. That way there isn't a sharp edge at the shadow, but a gradation or transitional edge from each of these shadows. The smaller the brushstroke gets, the choppier the brushstrokes become. And I'm also aware of that, and I want to be very careful not to make things so broken up that I'm just working on this foot the entire time because of all the small nuances that I have to be aware of as I'm making changes to everything. I also need to be mindful of the ruddiness of the foot, which means I can darken the values through here quite a lot. They're not going to be as bright as what's going on up towards the top of the body. Now I'm going to zoom in. I have enough information here where I can work off of memory now a little bit. So I have the side plane along here, top plane along through here, side plane of the tendon over here, side plane of the tendon through here, side plane, and then side plane next to the toenail. There's these little cast shadows of each of these toes on the ground plane. Probably want to put those in as well so we can see some differences in the surfaces. Transitional planes as they're turning back away from our view. This is all too aggressive through here. I'm going to come back over it and remove the really dark values. Cross the toenail here, cross the toenail here, cross the toenail here and here, and of course the bigger toenail. Some of this light across this area. Cut the toenail visibly back there. Sharpen the shapes of the toes. Small side plane next to the toenail on each of these toes. Darken the front planes a little further. Under the big toe, to the side of the big toe. Across the front of the big toe. Across the tops here and back here to cut the knuckles in. And then zooming out, you can start to see those forms beginning to develop more visually. So that would be the smaller surfaces. There isn't as much rendering, but there's still rendering to do. Just realize that this is a little bit too dark through here, and it's really sharp, so I want to soften that up a little bit more. And yeah, like I said before, I'm not going to be able to take you through the entirety of this and render every little nuance out all the way up to a sharpened finish, but you can see how all of these are gradations. They're all transitions from an edge inward or from an edge outward, from top to bottom, from side to side. It's all gradients. It's all transitional. And the more I stay aware of that, the easier it is for me to continue turning these forms as much or as little as I need to because of how much I want it to either be impressionistic looking or hyper-realistic looking. And that's just a matter of how soft the gradations become based upon how soft I want them to look. There's the highlight on the gray trochanter in here that I need to pop just a little bit further. But I don't want it to be so bright and white that you end up looking there over everything else within that space. It's not an area that needs to be turned into a focal point at all. And that same thing happens out here in these shadow patterns. They get softer as they go further from the subject matter. So I'm going to work along the edge of the shadow pattern here and go softer. And then as it gets closer to the leg, it gets sharper. And where things are too soft or too ambiguous, I can always take the floor color and come back in, back and forth until there's a nice balance between the two. Now I know that there's the lift of the cloth. There's a few pipe folds that are passing through this, but I'm not going to get caught up in those at this point. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to pull a gradation from back here towards her because the cloth is also not as brightly lit back there as it is when we're getting closer to her. Then go this way to cross hatch it, making sure that it stays lighter out over here. And then within the shadow pattern, I'm going to use reflected light back here and open up the darkness, making it lighter in value, and then gradating that as it gets closer to her, it's going to get darker. And the further out it is, the lighter it's going to be on the interior of that shadow. And then where it's the closest to her is where it would have a slight ambient occlusion to it, so I can go even darker there. But looking in the photo, her skin is darker than the shadow on the floor. So it would probably be a good idea to also recognize the darker value here before I get too caught up in darkening the floor shadow too much. So there's a hierarchy of lightness to darkness that I have to contend with. And where there's slightly darker values, they need to be stated as soon as possible. That way I can judge the range of value that I'm dealing with in each of these places and not overdo it in one area and not enough in another area. I see this happen all the time with work from my students where there's too much focus on one little thing instead of thinking globally, trying to adjust everything as much as possible to build the hierarchies. That way, towards the end, we're not having to destroy a whole area and start all over again because we put emphasis in the wrong areas of value. And then really quickly, I'll just go ahead and spot a few more values here and there along these edges to turn the forms just enough so you can see a start of the gradations. Gradation along there. There's a gradation along here. There's the lighter gradation through the deltoid here. There's the gradation up and over the clavicle, the deltoid, and the acromion process of the scapula, which is going to soften this whole area up through here. There's the gradation from the pectoralis through here. And there's the gradation across the pectoralis and the breast forms through here. Don't worry about overpainting parts like the bikini. I don't have to think about that right now. I'm going to use that as a sacrificial area. If these gradations and transitions on her skin need to pass over it for the time being so that I can get a stronger form for her, I'm totally fine with that. This can come later. I can work on the value transitions for the darker cloth later on. But it's more important that I'm able to turn the muscles in space and get more three-dimensionality out of her body. And then we have those same gradations along here, along her back, over on this side of the cylinder form, darker underneath here where the skin pinches, darker through the front of the torso here, through the front of the abdominal wall here, over the external oblique, through here, and then down in here where this pinches and turns away from the light source and allowing it to be the brightest right up along through here in the serratus muscles. And then from this, it's just a matter of neutralizing the tones so there aren't all those brush strokes in there, softening the edges so the forms turn more gracefully, and then doing all the same work again over in the shadow side. These are more halftones than they are shadows. I'm going to go ahead and lighten up all of this through here, and then also give it a little bit more gradient transition. Do the same thing right underneath here, through this space, soften that core shadow up a little bit more, and then through the bikini top, making sure that there's a gradation along here, pulling all the overpaint out of here, going a little bit darker, which we can't do too much of, but right along here, making sure that the darkest or highest point of contrast is over this part of the form. And then in this particular area, I'm going to go a half a value lighter up through here to help turn the form even further, and a little lighter still back along here where this is facing towards the light source. And that gives me a lot more dynamic range within this dark object to turn form and to make things read much more easily in 3 dimensions. And of course, fix the shapes. Gradient up along through here, along the neck, through here, along the top of the shoulder. This whole entire surface is a full value darker than the neck. The clavicle has some brightness to it, towards the shoulder, but all through here there's a gradation or a halftone darkening all of this area. And this is getting the bigger transitional planes, thinking low poly facets like we looked at in the cylinders. The 8-sided cylinder is what I'm sort of doing here. I'm being very blunt about each change in direction along the cheekbone up here, across the forehead up here, across the bridge of the nose through here, through the muzzle, turning this to make it round looking, across the chin, and then everything under the cheekbone is darker because it's turning away from the light source. So I'm going to block in that big space within the eye socket here, darken that down just a little bit more, giving it a very clear distinction between the socket and the rest of the face plane. Now, as you can see with what I'm doing, things are becoming more and more believable. We have to do the same thing in the shadow side. We have to find the occluded areas and block those out with their respective value. And that's going to help us see more dimensionally within the shadow side. Having some value indication for the navel because it is the darkest spot within the shadow there. But then also following the core shadows up along through here, through the abdominal wall, into the lower abs, and then in the occluded areas next to the fingers. There's reflected light on the back of the arm. So I'm going to darken the front of the arm and the fingers. So there's a difference in value of those shapes. Going to turn the form up here along the top of the rib cage. Going to turn the form down along over here where the abdominal wall separates from the oblique. Going to darken through the pit of the neck in here and across the top of the shoulders back here like I did over on this side. So we can see all the major changes in the shadow side of the figure. And then it's just a matter of massaging them into softer gradations, easier to see transitions. And your anatomy knowledge is going to help you make better choices how to carve those shapes up so they don't end up feeling stiff or out of place with the rest of the forms. There is a little bit of reflected light on the back of the arm that makes the back of the arm even brighter than all of the rib cage. I want to hint at that through here. I don't want to push it too far. And as it gets brighter, I'll just take some of the shadow value and pull it back into that area. But that definitely gives me one more surface area to work with so that I have 3 plane changes across this arm. And then it's just a matter of going in and lengthening or shortening each of the gradations so that it has the right length of transition. But as we zoom out, I'm going to turn off all these gradations for a moment. There's where we started, and here's where we are now. And everything I'm doing is a gradation. There is nothing different about any of these gradations other than my knowledge of the anatomy that I'm gradating over the top of. It's that knowledge that helps me make a stronger gradation. If I don't know the anatomy, I'm only guessing at what kind of gradation I'm trying to build with. So this is a confluence of many different parts of the drawing process that's helping me generate the right marks that I'm making. A little bit of form, a little bit of light, a little bit of anatomy, a little bit of perspective, a bit of depth that goes along with perspective, but still has different tools to ponder when we're dealing with this: clarity, color, contrast. And a little bit of composition. Where do I want the focal point to be based upon where the light source is the strongest or where I want the viewer to look? And all of those elements together, all of those tools together, help me form the idea and understanding of what kind of gradation I'm trying to pull, how far to make it, how dark to make it, how long to gradate it, or how abrupt to gradate it. But that's all I'm doing to complete the picture. Now, before I start this one, which has outlines around it that I also have to remove from the image, and I'm going to see really quickly if that's a layer I can turn off. Yes, it is. Good. Now, before I get going, I've had a question asked, what about using the gradation tool? Well, the problem with the gradation tool, and I'll show you here using his arm, just in this one area here. The problem with using the gradation tool is this. When you pull your gradation, the gradation tool doesn't know how to judge the difference between a tendon, the muscle head, a change in direction, or anything of that sort. You could use gradation tools if you understand technically how to work with these tools, and you can create smaller shapes using the marquee tool. You could. But that is a lot of extra work, and it's not going to create the kinds of transitions that are necessary to turn the form in the appropriate way. So my advice to you is just don't use it. Don't bother using it at all. It's not worth all the extra effort of cleaning things up beyond using that tool. Now with this particular image, I'm going to go into a much more faceted direction, easier to understand what's going on with the process, and not so refined so quickly. So here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to select the shadow value, and then knowledge of anatomy is going to help me with blocking in the top of the shoulder over here and the top of the shoulder over here, the side of the bicep all along through here, the underside of the bicep all along through here. I'm going to darken this down just a little further. The side of the deltoid along here as it goes to the anterior head. The change in direction of the brachioradialis along here. The underside of that muscle. The side plane, transitional plane between the dorsal side or the lateral side of the arm to the anterior edge. The change in transition of both the hand and the finger and the thumb. The tensor fascia lata, the rectus femoris, the top of the rectus femoris along here and the adductor muscles, the underside of his abdominal wall through here, the side plane of his abdominal wall through here, where the serratus muscles are along here, the transitional plane of the pectoralis muscle here, the pectoralis muscle over here, the split between the deltoid and the pectoralis up along here, that same split over on this side, the underside of the pectoralis through here, the medial edge of the deltoid over here, the underside of the pectoralis through here. The entire abdominal wall from the pectoralis, because all of this is getting darker as it drops down through the belly, which also means this entire side needs to darken accordingly. So it needs to be even darker than the front side of the belly. The underside of the rectus femoris and vastus medialis on the leg closest to us. And I'm going to do that again because that brushstroke was horrible. The transitional side of the calf muscle group and the tibialis anterior along the shin bone. The medial side of the foot all along through here. The lateral side of this foot transitioning across the top plane. Side plane of his skull on the forehead and on the cheek. The underside of the eye socket on the far side. Across the bottom of the forehead through the glabella. Through the muzzle. Side plane of the bridge of the nose. Along the medial line of the pectoralis muscles through the sternum. I'm going to increase the size of this plane over here. And then the entire upper arm of this arm closest to us is even darker because it's turned away from the light source. Far side forearm flexors along the bicep in the front, along the thumb, across the knuckles, and you can see the big picture already developing. Then along all of the terminators, softening them into the tones that I've generated here so that there's a more transitional connection between the halftones and the shadow tones. Down along through here. And you can already see the big picture emerging. That's the importance here. This is the way that I would shade in my pictures, right? I would be very quick and abrupt about it because I understand what I'm aiming for. I get the goal. But in order to teach it, like the last demonstration that you saw, we have to go little surface by little surface to understand what it actually means to create a gradation. And then once we understand that, then we can be a little bit more abrupt and developed here to get big things accomplished very quickly. But that means that there's going to be cleanup to do, but I'm also consciously aware of the anatomy. So I understand how to fix these things. I'm not lost on the information. The information is very well understood. That's not to say that you won't get it. It's just that if you don't have knowledge of anatomy, this does get harder to do. And it's harder to see all of these transitions. The occluded space under the arm along here. The occluded space next to the neck through here. The front of the neck along in here. The side plane of the face is a little bit darker through this area. Along the underside of the deltoid at the top of the tricep. I'm going to go back through the armpit here and darken it down a little more. Against the bicep on the far side. The underside of the oblique along here where the light is not reaching. Along the front of the rectus femoris here. Along the tensor fascia up here. The cast shadow from the arm onto the thigh on the far side of the leg. Across the knuckles of this hand closest to us. Along the radius bone through here. And through the brachioradialis muscle all the way up to its insertion. So that's the big picture. Now I'm going to go ahead and work on individual areas with smaller facets. The bicep along the front here, bringing the front plane back into view. Pulling the tricep back through here a little farther. Finding the core shadow for the deltoid through here. So there's a little more transition. And because this is on its own layer, I can very easily remove all the excess that has pushed out beyond the figure. That's one of the luxuries of painting digitally, is that you have all these secondary controls to work with. I'm going to grab the light from the front to use for the reflected light on the back, but I'm not going to push this bright. I just want to create a visual gradation to remind me of what I'm going to need to do more subtly on the back side of the figure. Do the same thing on the back of the elbow through here, the back of the tricep through here, and the back of the deltoid up along here. The back of the neck through here. And now I'm going to go with a slightly lighter value for the highlights on his chest. He does have some, what I want to think of it is like perspiration, because he's under these lights, probably been shooting photos for a while now, and his skin is starting to glisten a little bit. So we're getting a slightly lighter value across both of the pectoralis muscles through here, across the front of the deltoid over here, on the forehead up through here. Notice though too, I'm not going that bright as of yet. I'm just putting in a slightly lighter value to remind myself of where these transitions need to occur. On the medial side of the leg, down along through here, slight highlight on the upper ab through here, and in the xiphoid process through the chest here. Then his knees have a slightly darker value across them. We only see this one, but they would both have that same thing happening. The hands are slightly darker, as all of ours would be, because they're exposed to light much more often than any other part of our bodies. So they're going to have a slight
tan to them. Now I'm going to come through and begin the refinement of all of these areas, creating longer, more distributed gradations in the areas where the masses are larger, like the oblique, the flanks on the sides of the body. There's a longer gradation passing through those areas. I'm not going to be super refined about it. I'm going to be as quick and as abrupt as I can be with it. I don't want to spend a lot of time being nitpicky about the small things at this point. I still want to be able to really crush through these shapes quickly so that I can see the big picture impression coming up. Now the shoulders have a broad gradation cutting across the entire body that I will need to eventually deal with. Through the sternum in here, a slightly sharper edge just under the clavicle over here, above the clavicle right over here, a slightly sharper edge where the pectoralis and deltoids separate over here as well as over here. Darker value range on the underside of the deltoid through here. A softer edge along the bicep on the far side. A softer edge on the forearm flexors, right up through the wrist, and a slightly darker edge on the outside of the arm over there. Slightly darker value on the underside of the forearm flexors through here, helping shift the masses so they're easier to see. Top of the deltoid through here is a little bit on the lighter side, or a little bit cleaner of a shape, I should actually say. It's not lighter in value, it's just a much cleaner shape than what I had in there before. A more forgiving gradation along the pectoralis here. So basically getting rid of all the choppiness. Softer through here. More refined shape on the underside of the pectoralis through here. Pulling these darker values into the sternum through here, and then softening this gradation so it isn't as sharp and harsh to the eye. And I would continue doing this throughout the entire body, in every area, until the big facets, like I showed you with the cylinders earlier, the difference in the 8-sided cylinder versus the 18-sided cylinder versus the 32-sided cylinder. Right? I'm going from the 8-sider now to the 18-sider. And then from the 18-sider to the 32-sider, creating even smaller increments within those facets. And then from the 32-sider into the 512-sider, trying to create those long continuous gradations if I choose not to be impressionable about the picture. If I want to be impressionistic, then I'm not going to be as careful about softening the gradations to such a degree that it becomes too smooth, too soft, too transitional. The term for this would be more impressionistic. A little bit more turn of the form over there. Bring some light back to the top of the thigh along here, but making sure that the values darken as they go down through the thigh along in here. And it's that shift in value from the underside of it over here to the front side of it over here that we see the separation between the closer leg and the further leg on him. Cleaning up the edges along the side of the thigh, pulling the background values into the picture to help clean up any noise on the contours of the figure. There's less transition through here. I want to make just a little bit more of an angle. This is also the stage where when you know that your anatomy is not right or the shape language that you've generated doesn't quite fit what you see in the reference, you make those changes now, using the big values of each of these areas to help refine the shape language. And then come back through and soften them or gradate them back in to the bigger forms that you're already generating. So what I'm noting now are all of the areas where I need softer edges against the shadow patterns. And I just want to keep moving around through the figure and refining until all those areas are softer and more transitional.
Sometimes a gradation could take you a few passes. Sometimes it can be done in one. Depending upon how well you understand your brushes that you're working with. If you're using new brushes every time you sit down and paint, there's a learning curve that you have to go through to understand the nuances and subtleties of your brushes that you're building with. For all of these demos, I use the same brush that I designed a long time ago. This isn't one that you can find on the marketplace. I designed it based upon some brushes that I liked working with, but I liked certain aspects of each of the brushes, so I combined some of the tools together, or some of the settings together, to form a new type of brush for myself. And it's the one that I feel resembles or feels like traditional material when I work with it. A traditional graphite or traditional charcoal pencil. And because I've used traditional tools for a long time, I know what I'm looking for when I'm pulling the strokes. And I know when I see something doesn't work. And I know how to fix it because I'm very conscious of these tools that I work with. You can see how things are coming up visibly. I'm going to need a little bit of reflected light on the back of the knee over here, through here, and on the top of the calf muscle through here, as well as across the calf muscle on the far leg through here, into the Achilles tendon, and on the front of the calf muscle group and shin bone on this side. And that leg needs a lot of refining because the shapes are very crude. But because of my knowledge of anatomy, it shouldn't take too long to get in there and make the changes to it. I'm going to soften up the values as these come up through the ankle. I'm going to darken the entire foot, at least one full value. Soften the edges on this foot over here, getting rid of all of the abrupt, harsh edges across each of the toe shapes. And then scan through the figure looking for any other really sharp edges that don't need to be there. It's those sharp edges that cause a lot of the problems. Our eye wants to match the sharpest thing we see, or the clearest thing we see, or the brightest thing we see. And I really don't want that to happen here. I want to be sure that I am in full control of everything that I'm doing, and that I'm not being influenced by the marks, the shape language, or the value range in the picture space. As advanced as you could be, unless you know that these things can influence you, it is really easy to fall victim to the mark making that we're doing and making mistakes to where we have to go back in and fix things a few times before everything looks just right. Experience really helps with all of this. The more you do it, the easier it is for you to recognize those attributes right away and make the changes accordingly. Hopefully this demo has shown you, though, how not to get caught up in all that little tiny stuff and how you can do all of this in much larger passes. But it's my knowledge of anatomy that's really helping me here to make the right decisions. If I didn't know much about anatomy, then I would have a much more difficult time doing this. There's a lot to learn in art, but if you can take enough time during the week to separate your week between work and study, you can gain the knowledge and the insight to the tools that you're lacking very easily. But a lot of us really don't want to take that time, especially those who have gone to school and invested a lot of time in school already. Because they've invested so much time in school, they feel like they've already done their time. And so getting this new knowledge is going to be more difficult for them to acquire, which is unfortunate because the less you know about the subject matter that you work with, the harder it is to work with, period. It just makes things much more difficult. It is worthwhile doing the work and doing the studies to get the rest of that information out of the way. You don't want your toolbox to be half full. You want it to be completely full, meaning that you have insight into all the parameters of how to make something realistically. That way you're never left second guessing. Because generating an idea is already hard enough as it is, but why make it even more difficult by not learning the things that you're going to use so often when you make something, especially if you're going to stick with making realistic looking art? It just makes sense to take the time to learn that stuff. And don't put it on the back burner and say, yeah, eventually. No, try to get it out of the way. The sooner you can get it out of the way, the less you have to think about it in the long run. So now we have all these choppy brushstrokes everywhere, but we have the big picture in place. We know where things need to go and how they need to be visually organized. And it's just a matter of living with the subject matter and working with this particular image long enough to soften and sharpen and transition all of the forms in a believable way to your liking with the technique that you're working with. And the more you know, the more you can put back in. Not all photo reference is going to be absolutely clear. There is going to be times when you may not understand what you're looking at all, but that knowledge base is going to help you put it right back in, knowing that you're looking at a certain part of the body, or a certain area of the forms, and or a certain bit of subject matter that you've been studying already, if there's costuming involved and so forth. So again, the gradation tool cannot do all of this work for you. It's done by hand. It's done by your knowledge, your understanding, and it's improved upon or shaped more appropriately through all of these big and micro gradations. There is no other tool set that you need to learn when it comes to rendering. It's just refining, which means that with your tools, you will want to practice doing gradations, whether you're working traditionally or digitally. Now I'm going to do a part 2 for these renderings, a video part 2. In that video, I'm going to work with traditional media, and we're going to explore color and turning the form using color. This video is strictly grayscale. The demonstrations I gave you had color in them, but that's to help you understand what the information is that we're working with in the first place and how to identify it. You can't really escape that subject matter at all, but I don't necessarily need to demonstrate with it right away. So look for part 2 coming soon. All right, we zoom out and you can see things are developing now. Some of these shapes are a little out of scale or a little bit off an angle, but it doesn't take very much to fix them. And it doesn't take very much to realign them or rescale them, but it does take knowledge. You'll find that I don't spend a lot of time looking really lengthy back and forth between the subject matter and what I'm painting with, because I have so much to do here. There really isn't a lot of time to ponder that. You can stare at the work and assess things as needed, but I have a tendency to do that a little bit closer towards the end instead of the beginning, because if I start it too soon, then I don't really get anything done right away. And what I want to be able to do is evaluate based upon big goals that have been accomplished and not hold myself back for too long, because that staring really does all of a sudden become an excuse for not painting. And I've sort of pseudo-traumatized myself that way by staring too much at every brushstroke that I put into my art that I do. And it takes a lot longer because of that. As far as the highlights go and the brighter values, I don't push those too bright. I slowly work my way into those. If you go too bright too fast, you throw the value range off. So now that I am where I am with this, I can test the values and see if they work better, slightly lighter. I can still go just a tiny bit lighter with those highlights. Not going to push it through the whole shape though, because a highlight is not bright for the entire length of the highlight. It's only bright where the light source is the strongest within that particular facet or face plane of each surface area. Opening up the light just a little bit more on the forehead and on the pectoralis muscles, across the bridge of the nose, and on the cheek planes, both of them. And as those values come up in brightness, the only other place where it's really bright is on his thumbnail, and then down in the tendons of his foot, and on the toe pads, the palm, and that's it. Everything else is darker in value. And this is a squint test. I'm squinting back and forth between my subject matter and the painting to make sure that the value range is working. It's really easy to go too bright too fast, especially when it comes to darker skin. It's really easy to go too far, take the value range too far, and then all of a sudden the skin doesn't look darker, it looks more metallic. It changes its surface quality and no longer feels like flesh. By keeping this value range down to a minimum, it's keeping things looking more healthy and more flesh-like. I'll pull a few brush strokes. I'll back up from my screen. Come back in and pull a few more brush strokes, back up from my screen. And this is the dance that I play back and forth until the big picture has come up to where it needs to be. And when I know that it's working well, then I can zoom in and refine. But until then, I do not want to zoom back and forth between the two. I want to stay at a distance, and I encourage you to do the same thing. Paint from a distance. The longer you can stay farther away from your subject matter. In fact, I would usually start my painting probably at this scale right here and block things in on this scale, making sure that everything fits accordingly before I zoom in and work on anything. Well, in this case now I can take a little bit of a lighter value across the chest through here. Big, broad brush strokes. Down through the abdominal wall and across this shoulder over here. And that's getting even closer to the range of value that's needed for his particular skin tones. And then I won't go any lighter than this. I don't want to misconstrue the ethnicity. I just want to make sure that the range of values are optimal for depicting this kind of skin. So that's the big, broad, faceted approach. Where the first demo was a little more refined, I got caught up in smaller nuances, but from area to area was able to clean things up. This is sort of doing a big pass over the whole thing. And this is the way that I would encourage you to do yours. Start globally as opposed to locally, and try to make sure that everything comes up together at the same time, so that you can then spend more time zooming in on smaller areas and be really careful not to change the range of value, just clean up the values. That's it. Because when you zoom in and start going darker and lighter and so forth, then when you zoom out, that area has a broader range of value than anything else in the picture, and now everything else is going to have to come up to meet that, which can really throw things off quite a lot. All right, I hope this has started you in the right direction for what rendering is. It isn't this uber tight, uptight way of getting into little tiny things a little bit at a time. It's all gradations. And the more you can stay big and general with those gradations, the easier it will be for you to evolve the forms and get to a finish even quicker than you think. Now that you know that rendering is nothing more than gradations, there is no more mystery as to what you should do with it. I'll see you in part 2. Take care, good luck with your work, and stay creative.
All right. Well, now that you've seen some gradation, I'm looking forward to working on part 2 because, of course, color's my favorite thing. Grayscale's fun and all, but taking something to a complete finish is where it's at least for me, that is. I love color, and you'll see that when we get into the next video, all the different attributes of color that I'm going to explain. Now, I'm not going to get too deeply involved in color theory. That's coming in a new series coming soon. But you do have to understand hue, value, chroma, and temperature a little bit to understand how to make the renderings work for you. And that's what we're going to talk about in part 2. All right, well, I appreciate you making it through this video, and I appreciate you following this entire series. If there's any questions or confusion, leave comments below so that I can address those. And I'm more than happy to either write you personally or put up a tutorial over on the Discord channel, which you should subscribe to, as well as this channel. Subscribe, please. And you'll be getting more videos coming soon on all sorts of different subjects, including specifics on character design, illustration, fine art painting, and so forth. We're going to cover the whole spectrum of 2D art at some point with a series of videos. So watch out for those. Thank you very much for sitting through all of this. Take care and stay creative. I'll see you in the next one.